So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to RE for a series of familiar faces, but also hopefully some new people. I think we've got various people online, so we've got a good crowd for what seems to be a very interesting talk, and I hope will be a very interesting talk by our speaker today, Patrick Quinton-Brown, who's currently the SMU, Singapore Management University down the road in the centre of the city. He's a familiar face to RE, he was a postdoc here 21 to 22, right? Since then went back to the UK to be to I guess your academic home, Oxford, which is where he did his PhD, and it's where he's published his new book, or the press where he's published his new book, which is what you're going to be talking about today, right? It's ostensibly a book talk.
Yes.
Okay, good.
Partly.
We're going to keep the crowd happy. That's good. Okay. So I'll hand it over to you, Patrick. You said you're going to speak about 45 minutes.
Right.
We've obviously got a chat panel on for the virtual audience, so feel free to add questions during the process of the talk, and I'll raise them at the end, along with any others.
Right.
Over to you, Patrick.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Tim. And I'm going to attempt to share my screen. If I could just get maybe a thumbs up. Is it okay? Fantastic. Right. So thank you again for the introduction, and it's wonderful to be back here at RE and at AS8, and yes, to see so many familiar faces. So my talk today is focused on this new book, very recently published with Oxford University Press, Intervention Before Interventionism. I'd like to give you a sense of where the book came from, what it's trying to do, but above all, sketch out a main argument, hence my chosen title, The Bandung Theory of Intervention Towards Peaceful Coexistence in International Society. Now, admittedly, this title might be surprising for some. Some in the audience might be thinking, not unreasonably, that Bandung, and here I'm referring to the Bandung Conference of 1955, officially known as the Asian African Conference, is precisely a meeting about non-intervention. Right? It's precisely about the spirit of Asian and African countries rejecting interferences in the domestic affairs of each other, about building bridges, building nations out of the ruins of empire, hence about raising flags and not trampling on them, as interventionists so often do. A Bandung theory of intervention would therefore seem to be a confusion. Bandung was a protest, right, against theories of intervention. And that would be the usual reading of the Bandung Conference in leading accounts of international society today. That's usually how we learn about Bandung in a growing literature on the neglected Southern sources of modern international norms and rules, on literature relating to the identity making of the global South, its contestation of liberal imaginaries and scripts, its role in the so-called global order versus justice debate. After all, adopted at Bandung were the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, which located non-intervention at the heart of a vision of friendly relations between the Tibet region of China and India. And non-intervention has been described as an Asian value, one, to quote Nehru, as old as our thought and culture, widely recognized as a defining trait of Asian civilizations. But I'm here to propose that Bandung, in fact, did have a theory of intervention, at least in a certain very particular sense. In 1955, 29 Asian and African countries do jointly declare a universal duty not to intervene, for whatever reason, in whatever form. The spirit of Bandung was and is absolutely non-interventionist. And yet the Bandung moment articulated a very significant and misunderstood theory of what it means to intervene in international relations. Bandung, I hope to convince you by the end of today's presentation, had a theory of intervention, particularly in the sense of what constitutes intervention as an act or as an event in IR. In the historical globalization of international society, this theory should be identified as Afro-Asian, inter-Asian, if we'd like. It should be seen as a non-aligned theory, one that's pluralist and anti-hierarchical, which chooses independence rather than a side in superpower or meta-ideological conflicts. And it goes a long way, I think, in explaining UN-based achievements of coexistence, freedom, and peace. So I have, I'm told, 45 minutes or so. And my talk will move in 5 steps, hoping to convince you through 5 steps. In the first part, I'll introduce the concepts of intervention and non-intervention in international society theory. So here I want to propose a problematization of prevailing accounts of global order. I'm going to say that a new interpretation, recovered from within Asian African practice, would provide a much better explanation of the function of the intervention concept, not least in this age we're living through of hegemonic transition. What we need, I'll say in the second part, is a much more critical and genealogical approach to the intervention problem. I'll recount an instructive story used as a kind of foil in the first chapter of the new book to explain the anti-naturalist and interpretivist commitments of my project. I want to suggest that so-called traditionalist literature, but also much post-traditionalist literature on this topic, has committed an egregious methodological error, one that the book tries to address. Third, I'll say a word about how I use genealogy to uncover an alternative explanation of international societal change. I'm trying to argue that the anti-colonial redescription of intervention, which we can date, if we'd like, to 1955, was a historical normative achievement of the non-aligned world, yet it remains deeply misunderstood, I think even misrepresented today. So I'll introduce the Bandung theory. Now, this theory, of course, had its critics, its excesses, and at times it was a theory abused and taken out of context. This often provided its political opponents with a pretense of ignorance. I'll say a word about that. And then finally, only after having done all the above, can we advance a novel critique of the liberal interventionist moment. We should understand the conceit of our late liberal interventionism, not merely as a matter of hubris, but rather something much more mendacious, particularly in relation to Bandung. And then we'll have some time for Q&A, which I really look forward to. I think we have almost 30 minutes. So this book, and we do have a hard copy somewhere in the room, Jim has it here. It's concerned with the meanings of intervention in the beliefs and practices of statespeople, right? It's not a book about events of intervention. It's an attempt at mapping out the politico-normative trajectories of those meanings over time. And on that basis, it's proposing a comprehensive revision of the work we think has been performed by this vocabulary since the end of the Second World War. And what prompted it was basically an attempt to escape from the shadow of an interventionism we know all too well. It was a shadow under which so many scholars and students of IR, especially of my generation, came to understand a global sovereignty intervention debate. In fact, the very first title of the book, then as a doctoral dissertation, was Ideologies of Intervention. And what interested me then and now is this attempt at escaping a kind of bewitchment, at becoming conscious of the ideological effects of a certain large-scale interpretation of global order, an interpretation that, true, might have done some things very well at the end of the Cold War, but must now be undone in a context very different from the one in which it gained currency. Because we lived once in an era of interventionism, and in that era, we became accustomed to a very particular narrative of the constitution of the Society of States. During the mid-20th century, we often said, a strongly sovereigntist iteration of world politics attained predominance over the course of decolonization, the Cold War, and a third world protest, as it was called, against Western-dominated order. This was a time when intervention, for any reason and in any form, was absolutely proscribed within the norms and rules of states, when good fences, in other words, made good neighbors. In just a few decades, however, and following the collapse of the Soviet Union, there emerged an internationally legitimate practice of intervening for higher purposes, of, as they said, saving strangers in places far away. To talk thereafter about intervention was most usually to talk about the appalling human rights abuses that are happening in various parts of the world, the international use of force as a right or as a duty to prevent those abuses, and the limits of sovereign equality. That interventionist era has surely now vanished. Rather, and quite suddenly, it's the discourse of non-intervention that seems everywhere in international relations today. The dominant discourse today, as a series of ongoing crises suggest, is once again about defending state borders, about respecting or realizing national identity, about putting up walls. To quote, for instance, the foreign ministers of the original BRICS countries in their June 2021 statement on multilateral reform, a more equitable and representative multipolar international system firmly committed to sovereign equality and non-interference in internal affairs is taking root in the relative decline of the United States. At the same time, this isn't only a story of emerging or emerged powers. It's also a story of Trump, of Brexit, and of populist, often far-right nationalism as a trans-regional phenomenon. And it, of course, encompasses and has exposed in greater moral and political complexity, changing perceptions of the injuries and ongoing destructiveness of interventions assumed of late. Calamity in Afghanistan and the ruins of Libya, for example. How are we to make sense of these sweeping changes in the discourses of global order? Following from the right to state sovereignty, the duty not to intervene is, after all, a cornerstone of modern IR theory and of international law and ethics. What might it mean to return to a world of non-intervention in multipolarity or the like? What's at stake, including as a matter of human values or rights or protection, when interventionism is left behind? True, for a long time, the dominant way of approaching these issues has been through the lens of cosmopolitan or liberal-solidarist duties, including the responsibility to protect, or R2P. But even if we're to recognize, as I think we should, that this approach illuminated an important post-Westphalian debate over the conditionality of state sovereignty, we should also admit that sovereignty as responsibility, at least as we usually know it, is not enough. Yes, R2P is one part of the story, and yes, longer histories might be told of related liberal arguments, but such orthodoxies do not help us come to terms with the more diverse functions of this language of intervention historically, and they have too little to offer us presently. Rather, what we need is a much more critical understanding that picks up where this dominant approach left off, that meets the much discussed death of R2P or an end of the era of humanitarian intervention, and in a way that not just exposes the imperial and colonial complicities of interventionism through bygone eras. I think those are by now very well established, but the normative and practical contributions of non-interventionism with respect to the pursuit of justice. A new research program for our turbulent present has to be rooted in an internationalist non-alignment and the discursive practices of the global South beyond its caricature. And I think it should be a story that starts when the formal membership of international society, arguably for the first time, comes to encompass the entire world in 1945, in my reading. Now, you might be wondering, why a journey back to the mid or late 20th century? Why a journey to Indonesia in 1955? Well, I suggest we ought to revisit this period, not just because it was one of heightened East-West geopolitical tensions, but because it was one of South-North encounters around grave injustice, inequality, and cultural difference that also have a clear bearing on the present. The period's so-called revolt against the West is not to be understood in a straightforwardly Bullian sense, that is, as a threat to the viability of global order, or of order as an essentially European or Western contrivance. Rather, we have to approach the Third World challenge as bound up in processes of contestation and exchange that transformed a much more contingent society of states. This book fits into then and builds upon a series of recent writings, some of which appear on the screen. And my interest is in tracing revolt in terms of its reconstituting of order and its redescribing of general norms and rules, which are processes we too hastily think to know already. After all, classical scholars of the intervention problem, R.J. Vincent and Nicholas Wheeler, for instance, have of course explored mid-20th century global order before. Yet existing writing has often neglected, if not outright forgotten, the debate that at the time was most prominently fostered by smaller states and the post-colonial world, not just whether intervention, yes or no to intervention, but what is intervention? What does it mean to intervene, according to whom and at what times? And historically, in fact, the answer is not at all obvious. In 1968, for instance, when the Journal of International Affairs published its special issue on intervention, the word was, quote, extremely common in discussions of international politics, but its wide usage had not resulted in a common understanding, making it as misunderstood as the balance of power or idea of splendid isolation were decades ago. Intervention then once invited a series of rich and unusual questions about military force and the promotion of human rights, of course, but also about dependence and peaceful coexistence, development, race and self-determination, domestic jurisdiction, and the meaning of competence in international law, and the structures and agents of the world economy, for example. A major task then of the book is to theorize fundamentally what Vincent Wheeler and others did not, that the definition of intervention is always a very deeply political question tied to the legitimation of power and wholly unresolved in the practices of states then and now. Furthermore, I suggest that this critique of the inadvertent naturalism of the English school, or what Richard Little once called the traditionalist school, might also be made of much post-traditionalist literature of the past 20 years. To take just one example, we might point to a recent and very important special issue of the Review of International Studies, which, in not, quote, wanting to get bogged down in the difficulty of defining the term, stipulated the definition of intervention as coercive interference or the international use of force. What interests me in this book, in contrast, is precisely reckoning with the difficulty of defining the term. And so along these lines, the book begins with an instructive story, which I use as a kind of foil to explain certain basic methodological insights I'm making, and specifically about concept formation and anti-naturalism. In 1967, the man on the screen, Professor James Rosenau, appeared at a conference in Princeton called Intervention and the Developing States. A very important conference, summoning over 200 from across political science, law, economics, and government, and a conference devoted to answering a very specific question. What do we mean by intervention in international relations? And James Rosenau opened the deliberations with a call for a, quote, properly scientific definition, one that would plainly, quote, recognize an interventionary act when it occurred. He, at that time, a prominent behavioralist, later, of course, an IR theorist, who recanted much of the quest for what he called analytic meaning, was warning against, in 1967, what he called undisciplined thought. He sought a more narrow and precise technical meaning, better suited for neutral predictions of behavior. If we were to have a clear debate about intervention, words should, quote, have the same meanings and ideas the same reference. Intervention was, he claimed, a particular sort of event in IR, something that happened not through speculation or through belief, but through coercion. Intervention meant coercive interference, often understood as the threat or use of force. And yet, he's rejected by conferees in 1967. And that rejection, as Rosenau himself admitted, was vigorous. In fact, he wrote 2 major articles afterwards in reply, confessing that the, quote, experience of the Princeton conference had become an inescapable part of his thinking. Why such a fierce rejection? And why should it become an inescapable part of our own thinking? Well, first, conference participants like Hans Singer, Michael Brecker, Richard Falk, and others surely knew that many of the interventionary acts with which developing countries were most concerned were not limited to coercion. They extended into other forms of foreign pressure. According to this tradition, a number of actions missing from the coercive definition properly belong under the umbrella of intervention. Some examples would be economic pressures, not limited to sanctions, tied foreign aid, economic dependence, the foreign exploitation of natural resources, fifth column activities, spying, sedition, foreign incitement of rebellion and the like, propaganda, and what was even being called then false or distorted news, In some contexts, even various forms of speech, like international censure. And hence, conference participants must have known, or were at least on the verge of knowing, that as an evaluative concept, as a moral and legal concept, as tied up with major international norms and rules, the definition of intervention presents a politico-normative dilemma. It ought to have been understood that intervention as coercive interference was hegemonic in the sense of serving certain great powers and colonial complicit in excluding the values of the post-colonial world. Defining intervention either broadly or narrowly in the context of a legal and moral duty not to intervene would serve particular masters. The book begins then with an illustration of how contestation of the intervention concept is an unavoidable feature of its explanation and its international function. Intervention is not just, as classical theorists would have it, a coercive ordering practice. Rather, it is the thing itself to be ordered. And it's only within the scope of such contested meanings and their partial institutional embeddedness, rather than the strictures of cosmopolitan liberal political theory or any posited conception of legitimacy, that accounts of global order should be given. We must therefore be attentive in a way we have not been before to the self-interpretations of statespeople, and as I show, especially the self-interpretations of statespeople from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. My aim is to map out a series of international struggles over what statespeople do and might do with this very important concept. Assessing discursive change is no longer a developmentalist account of convergence upon a single higher enlightened understanding, but about contestation and evaluative redescription as part of an ongoing and intrinsically unequal process in which states compete to legitimize their international interactions. The project therefore reflects the basic purpose and interpretivist commitments of a genealogy. To make this argument, I uncover a series of different theories of what it means to intervene and their uptake and displacement in beliefs over time. I suggest that what is meant by intervention, and therefore what's meant by a duty not to intervene, must always be located in the context of its historical use. Now, I don't have time to trace all the theories discussed in the book, but I could synthesize my account by saying that the non-interventionism of the 20th century is best understood in terms of a clash between two broad ways of thinking, or discursive practices, as I call them in the book. On the one hand, there emerged, particularly in the Cold War practice of Western great powers, what I call a dictatorial theory of intervention. That's a reference to the writings by jurists like Lawrence and Oppenheim, who define intervention as dictatorial or coercive interference. And what this theory basically refers to is the idea of intervention as the threat or use of armed force. On the other hand, there emerged an anti-colonial theory of intervention as the effect or outcome of foreign pressure, and specifically pressure at the expense of domestic affairs. This is a theory introduced in the second chapter of the book. It draws on, yes, Latin American legal tradition, particularly the writings of the Argentinian diplomat and publicist Carlos Calvo. Yet this second anti-colonial theory of intervention also went beyond Calvo. At the Bandung Conference of 1955, the duty never to intervene came to be associated with new international humanitarian duties, particularly duties related to anti-colonialism and anti-racism. From this view, humanitarian solidarity was to be clearly distinguished from humanitarian intervention. Now, the idea of an internationalism that is not an interventionism might sound counterintuitive, but it was not counterintuitive in the beliefs of Asian and African statespeople at the time. How could this be? Well, part of the reason had to do with their conception of domestic jurisdiction, a conception that scholars and diplomats later forgot or misconstrued in favor of one based on geography rather than on law. But another part, perhaps even more important, had to do with the idea of self-determination, understood as a right as well as a primary human right, which all states had a duty to promote and respect. Developing in detail this Bandung theory and tracing its institutional trajectory in the United Nations is the focus of chapters 3, 4, and 5. But let me explain it for us a little further. We often remember the non-interventionism of the Global South as absolute or unconditional. That much is correct. The 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, also known as the Panchil, clearly did proscribe intervention in any form, for whatever reason, in the internal affairs of other states. And in particular, the choice to arrange in this Panchil a specific pillar of mutual non-intervention beside and not within other pillars, such as mutual non-aggression, reflected an interpretation of the intervention concept based on the outcomes of foreign pressure, rather than the means by which that pressure occurred, such as the use of force. Yet, Asian African practice was not simply a re-articulation of Calvo's theory of intervention at the expense of the Oppenheim-Lawrence one. In 1955, the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence were adopted in the 10 principles of Bandung. There were 10 principles at Bandung. And taken together, these 10 interlocking principles went beyond and transformed the meaning of the 5. As scholars like Quinn-Pham and Robbie Shilliam tell us, attendees at Bandung introduced anti-colonialism and anti-racism as constitutive principles of a new world order rather than as background aspirations in a bipolar rivalry of great powers. So the positive face of an emerging non-aligned and global Southern identity was in fact about legitimizing international actions to put an end to the human rights abuses of traditional empire and extreme racism. Such solidarist international actions might appear to contravene the duty never to intervene through any form of foreign pressure in the essentially domestic affairs of states. But only at first blush. In discursive practice prominent in UN debate over the treatment of Indians in South Africa, for example, and notably in the decisions of the International Court of Justice, the reach of domestic jurisdiction was described as an essentially relative question. Under these discursive conditions, voluntary acceptances of sovereign obligations, under the UN Charter, under multilateral treaties, under international law more generally, were known at once as a manifestation of sovereignty and its limitation, but not its violation. The prevention of apartheid and of genocide, for instance, came to be understood as an international responsibility, rather than as an essentially domestic question. So too did the promotion of self-determination, understood initially as a principle, then as a right, and as a primary human right. To quote Fadil Jamali, the Iraqi delegate at Bandung, in his discussion there of the problem of colonialism and the dependent peoples of North Africa, quote, "Well, we cannot interfere with the internal affairs of France, but we can invoke the right of self-determination of the people. We can invoke human rights." Afro-Asian solidarity in this account is hence about an internationalism that was also a non-interventionism. There was a crucial difference, which I trace in historical self-descriptions, between an interventionist and an internationalist. And that crucial difference was increasingly recognized in the norms and rules of statespeople. Hence, a deeply misunderstood theory of intervention underpinned what British IR theorist Martin White termed in the late 50s the Bandung UN. This was the UN that hastened the liquidation of empire and dismantled international racial hierarchy. It was the UN that supported, to take just one example, the just struggle of the peoples of Southern Africa to self-determine, to achieve their sovereignty, and to end apartheid. Yet if Martin White got that phrase, Bandung UN, very right, he also got something very wrong. When he claimed that, quote, the limits of Article 2, Paragraph 7, one of the non-intervention paragraphs in the UN Charter, one of 2, were first explored in the case of South Africa, and that, quote, it was not contemplated at San Francisco, where the UN was founded, that the UN should be an organization for collective intervention. He also misunderstood the Bandung theory of what it means to intervene. And it's on account of a similar contemporary misunderstanding that it's today so commonplace to detect in the internationalism of the global South a contradiction with absolute non-interventionism. As newly independent Morocco once observed in the UN General Assembly, Cold War invocations of Article 2.7 of the Charter served as a kind of, quote, shy and disguised veto of the old imperialist countries on matters of empire and race. Chile also referred to a, quote, little veto cast against Afro-Asian organizing at this time. But these vetoes and these invocations of non-intervention were confused, and soon were globally recognized as confused. For in an anti-colonial register, acts of intervention can never uphold human rights or humanitarian duties. Rather, acts of intervention are always and essentially violations of human rights and shared humanitarian responsibilities, including those of self-determination. The Bandung UN was an organization then for legitimate and legal solidarity, not collective intervention. And so the main argument of the book is that what I call the anti-colonial redescription of intervention, of what it means to intervene, was an astonishing achievement in the Society of States, and yet it's been deeply misunderstood. Major institutional developments of our times, the first UN Declaration on Non-Intervention in 1965, the Friendly Relations Declaration of 1970, the second Declaration on Non-Intervention of 81, the humanitarian intervention debates of the 90s, even the UN Charter itself cannot, I argue, be properly appreciated outside of the politics and vicissitudes of this Bandung spirit. And what I show is that solidarist change in Cold War international society is really about the falling out of a certain colonial complicit Oppenheim-Lawrence theory of intervention and the relative ascendance of the Bandung theory until at least the 1970s or early 80s. Now, it's not, of course, that such a solidarist internationalism was a matter of universal consensus. Even within the nascent non-aligned movement, for instance, fierce disagreements emerged about its limits and about its proper application. There were obvious questions to be asked, for instance, about the substantive limits of what Sukarno, in his opening address at Bandung, called the, quote, moral violence of nations in favor of peace. To the extent that Sukarno was referring to the idea that, quote, diplomacy for us is not a matter of the big stick, but of all the, quote, spiritual, all the moral, all the political strength of Asia and Africa, then the ground seemed sure enough. But it became less certain as one tried to move forward. At times, the ground collapsed altogether. So by the late 1960s, for instance, a major bifurcation appears between moderate and radical wings of the Global South project. Moments like this Tricontinental Conference of 1966 can be understood as attempts at radically appropriating the Bandung spirit and its theory of internationalist action, including, in this case, implausible coercive forms. And we can see these tensions between the moderates and radicals play out in the friendly relations process, where the idea of tricontinentalist solidarity was specifically cited by a moderate majority as illegal, illegitimate, and subversive interventionism, not internationalism. There are also, of course, quandaries to be noted about what is a people, external versus internal self-determination, and what Tony Angie calls third world sovereignty. That is, quandaries about how to make and maintain nation states in the aftermath of empire, about the possibilities and the pitfalls of territorial integrity and the doctrine of uti possidetis juris, about the theme of internal colonialism, the violence of the post-colonial state. So appearing then as a warning is surely the case of Westphalian, notably central to Indonesian foreign policy objectives at Bandung. And then there's the matter of finding intervention in spheres wrongly omitted in recent writing. The second last chapter of the book focuses on the centrality of intervention language in the new international economic order and New World Information and Communication Order, for example. The book captures changing conditions of what it means to intervene in terms of structural and exploitive relationships within a world economy. So intervention in relation to debt traps, to tied aid, to foreign propaganda, again, what was called in the 60s and 70s, false news, and beyond. At the same time, the book is reflecting in this chapter on the alleged internationalism, but not interventionism, of acts of nationalization, producers' associations like OPEC, and the duties to balance and correct international information flows. Again, such an ambitious and emancipatory conception was not a matter of straightforward consensus, nor, of course, were the NIEO and NWICO political success stories. But the key point being made in the book is that this recurring encounter or struggle of the anti-colonial or Bandung theory on the one hand, and the Oppenheim-Lawrence or dictatorial theory of intervention on the other, best explains how the function of this language was changing. To sum up, it was during and through Cold War decolonization that states overcame a once hegemonic theory of the non-intervention principle, one that weakened the hand of the UN, in fact, one that had been intended to preserve sovereign licenses of colonial and racial exploitation, and one that had been established in a moment of great power unity that accompanied the end of the Second World War. Likewise, I suggest that the post-colonial or the post-Cold War interventionist era was not some clean break with the past, or a development that can be understood outside of the post-colonial world. By providing a more critical explanation of large-scale social change, the book is unmasking the post-Cold War moment as itself one of normative redescription. Liberal interventionism was a radical and skillful inversion of our values, radical in the sense of effacing previous understandings of sovereign equality, which rejected any notion of an international hierarchy of peoples or of races or of civilizations. And it was a skillful contestation in a rhetorical and ideological sense. For liberal interventionism seems premised on a dangerously teleological and untruthful view of post-colonial international society. This is a view of historical post-colonialism in which sovereignty becomes a shield, right, behind which states, or quasi-states as they're sometimes called, mainly in the developing world, and guilty of the most heinous of crimes, could legitimately hide from their international responsibilities. One that claimed that the Society of States, divided for over 40 years between competing Cold War blocs, was unable to act and powerless in its pursuit of justice, frozen by the sovereigntism of the Global South project. Scholars like Rajan Menon, I say in the book, are right to say that liberal interventionism proved highly conceited in the 90s and early 2000s. But the conceit of our late liberal interventionism was not merely a matter of hubris. The true conceit of the liberal interventionist moment was its misrepresentation, its distortion of this Bandung UN I've been describing, and the proper meaning of non-intervention in global order. So we can now be very clear. In the Cold War, there of course did emerge glaring examples in which flagrant breaches of human rights stirred little, if any, criticism in the UN or in global Southern forums, such as the Organization of African Unity or the OAU. But it does not simply follow that an absolutist conception of sovereignty was a feature of the non-aligned vision of anti-hierarchical global order. It rather follows that charter provisions, including OAU charter provisions, were being shamefully misconstrued and understood outside of their context. To interpret the principle of non-intervention as a shield for the commission of mass atrocities would be just as empty a moral gesture and just as much an abuse of its true meaning as the little veto of Article 2.7 invoked during the 50s and 60s to suppress the UN-based anti-colonial and anti-racist movement. It would be to confuse, yet again, just as Martin White did, an established set of beliefs in the Global South that, in direct reference to genocide and crimes against humanity, non-intervention can never serve as an excuse to evade international obligations. Bandung then was not and is not a kind of Eastphalia, if by that we mean a turn to unqualified sovereignty or a reference to a Westphalian world of unaccountable princes. Bandung rather counts as a model of UN-based solidarity lost to time. It's to be understood then, yes, in terms of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence and its absolute non-intervention, of course, but also in terms of the dynamic nature of domestic jurisdiction and jurisdiction as a matter of law and society, not simply of geography, in terms of the duty not to intervene as consistent with the protection and promotion of human rights, including the primary right of peoples to self-determination. In terms of competing aspirations of, yes, the 1965 Declaration of Non-Intervention or the 81 Declaration, and in terms of economic sovereignty and informational sovereignty, what today we might be tempted to call digital sovereignty. Yet as multiple strains of the Bandung theory slipped from view, especially in the 90s, and as they came to be replaced, the meaning of the international implementation of shared responsibilities blurred mendaciously into the historically separate activity of suspending state sovereignty. And this, the liberal interventionist moment, was a resurrection of the logic of trusteeship against which global Southern revolt was originally waged. And so my hope is that a recovery of Asian African theories of intervention might enliven us to the possibilities of the intervention concept today. Understanding the conditions of what it is meant to intervene might offer some thin ray of hope in these very dark times for the Society of States. And genealogical analysis is serving as a kind of repertoire for global reordering. The total number of theories covered in the book, as you can see on the screen, go beyond the ones I've highlighted in the presentation. And not all of these logics are, of course, worth salvaging. Some are worth remembering precisely because of how very wrong they were. But what I'm saying is that charting, as I have on the screen and as I do through the book, the conflicts involved in their use requires unlearning much of what we thought to be true since the end of the Cold War. But the dilemma of our present crisis can no longer be taken for granted as a kind of stark conflict between a crudely sovereigntist order and a cosmopolitan justice, nor should we assume it involves a stark choice between sovereignty or human rights, the nation or global governance. To trace the trajectories of the Bandung theory is to undo these old infatuations. The dilemma of our present crisis is rather which theory of intervention? Thank you, and I'm very much looking forward to your questions.